Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to be celebrating our 10-year anniversary by having me as the interviewee. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozorak, and this is episode number 153 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. The Roundhouse is a Streamliner Media presentation. If you are interested in having video and digital storytelling to help your freight or tourist railroad or museum, I'd love to talk to you, and you can learn more at streamlinermedia.com. Today, we are celebrating 10 years of the Roundhouse. It is insane to think about. And if you've been along for the ride for years or months or just days, I cannot begin to express how grateful I am to have you here. And thank you for your support. I asked you guys on Facebook how we should celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the podcast, and Mark Rayum suggested that I be interviewed. So I'm delighted to have Kelly Lynch, who's been on the podcast before, interview me, and I get to talk about the development of the show, my history of filmmaking, next generation railroaders, my perspectives on heritage railroading. It was really great to talk with him, and I look forward to sharing that conversation with you. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/the Roundhouse for as little as $1 a month, you're supporting the work that we do on the show, and I appreciate that very much. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of today's episode, Strasburg Railroad Mechanical Services. If you have needs pertaining to equipment restoration, visit mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Last thing I want to make you aware of is that Next Generation Railroaders will have its first public programming on March 4th at 7 p.m. We're going to be having Ed Lockyer from the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington talk about what volunteer opportunities he sees as available and the qualities that he looks for in volunteers at the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. If you want to check that out, even if you're listening to this after the date, there's a link in the description of the show notes for episode 153 of this podcast. Our guest today, see, this is how great it is with me. Our guest interviewer today is the executive director of Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. Please welcome back to the Roundhouse, Mr. Kelly Lynch.
Good afternoon, Nick.
This is usually the part where I start by asking, how you got into railroading and so forth. It is so weird to switch over the reins. So I'm going to indulge a little bit as my last bit of asking the questions and asking how things are going with you and some of the highlights you've been up to in the past few years since we last talked on the show.
Well, Nick, I'm happy to join you here for your what is it, your 10th anniversary that we're celebrating. So happy to interview you to help celebrate that. But Fort Wayne has had an extraordinarily busy year. I was actually just reflecting on it because we're recording this on February 1st. We've just concluded January, and we recently announced that we acquired the Kichigami Club, which is a nickel plate Pullman that several years ago we'd made an inquiry on about a lease to purchase, and weren't able to put together a deal at that time. And then the opportunity for the Kichigami Club to join us via a lease in 2024 to operate behind the nickel plate 765 and the nickel plate 358. As a part of our tourist program, the Indiana Rail Experience. That opportunity came about, and then the acquisition came about. And so that is what I've been describing our activities like the last few years is we're building a chessboard, and you don't build all your pieces all at once, but you try to put a lot of things in play, and you're planning for not just the first move, but the move after that, and the move after that, and the move after that. So the Kichigami Club was really sort of like the last bit of really exciting news from last year. But I think the biggest news that we discussed last year, or released last year, was our acquisition of the near Central 3001, the Mohawk, which itself was a 3+ year conversation with the city of Elkhart, which we announced in October, I believe. So just a lot of really great progress and excitement in building the chessboard of tourist railroading over in Indiana.
The amount of projects you have going is astounding. And congratulations, by the way, on being Fort Wayne's first executive director. It's tremendous that the organization is in a position to be able to have such a person in such a role.
Yeah, I guess I left that out. We also hired our first employee in our 52-year history. And I joke that I was a 20+ year job interview, but I've been a part of this organization since before I was born. My dad was part of the original group that took the locomotive out of the park and restored that. So it really is one of the a professional capacity for this organization, and to be such an instrumental part of its transformational growth in the last couple of years, but also in the last decade, just as a volunteer. We are really trying to prepare the organization not just for the next 10 or 20 years, but for the generation after the current one. I'm 39, I'll be 40 in September, so we're trying to think beyond ourselves and make sure that this lasts well beyond ourselves and is set up really for the future. And one of the things I'm really proud of is that in 2022 we had 0 serviceable passenger cars because we have been so focused on the operation, maintenance, and restoration of the 765. And that's been very understandable because that is such a full-time vocation for a nonprofit like ours. And we did at one point have a operational passenger train fleet in the 1980s and early 90s. And those passenger cars were sold in the early 90s to pay for the mortgage on our shop. But what's happened is that the logistics and the financials of leasing and shipping passenger cars, especially Amtrak certified passenger cars, is so onerous. And to do that and support a mainline or any type of steam excursion like what we run with the 765 just is incredibly challenging. And now that we've had this opportunity to create our own tourist railroad experience with the Indiana Northeastern Railroad Company, we have been building our own passenger fleet. And so in 2022, we had 0 serviceable passenger cars, and now we have 6 serviceable passenger cars. Well, 7 now with the Kichigami Club. But we've acquired over 16 passenger cars in the last couple of years. And so our goal is to just keep turning out 1 car per year, give or take, over the next couple of years, as long as we're able to successfully fundraise and find sponsorships and strategic relationships, which is how we were able to acquire the cars that we've been able to acquire. Because without the passenger train, the steam engine cannot run, it cannot pull people, people cannot buy tickets, they cannot support what we do, and all of these beautiful, wonderful trains stay in the barn and don't make anybody happy and don't do anything, which means that our organization cannot fulfill its mission and vision. And so ultimately our vision for the operation is to have our own self-sufficient passenger train excursion set that we can then carve up and customize for our rail tourism operation. So eventually one day we might actually have 2 separate train sets, 2 power cars, all first class section over here and all coach section over here. We just outshopped 2 open window cars that we converted out of some Barnum and Bailey elephant cars that were Union Pacific baggage cars before that. So it's really a startup tourist railroad, and it will be for the next year or two. Even though we've been around for over 50 years, we are building this tourist railroad setup really from scratch. So it's really been exciting what we've been able to do. And I like to tell people it's not because of sheer luck. We've been very well prepared, very poised to take on this opportunity, but it's not all because it's just one or two people doing everything either. I mean, we've been extremely fortunate to have donors, foundations, and supporters that the moment we were able to say, hey, we're going to do something really special in our backyard, we were able to pull a trigger and have the support that we needed to make so many great things happen all at once, to acquire 7 New York Central passenger cars, to acquire a depot. We've been able to raise over $2 million in the last couple of years just to sort of support a lot of these acquisitions and restorations. We have a dome observation lounge car from the Canadian Pacific now too. And that's a $600,000 project. So I don't know if we'll get to that very soon. But now what's really cool is that we have the Pullman car, the Kichigami Club, which was a nickel plate business car in the middle of its career. And we've got a 1950s Bud observation dome lounge car. So we sort of have a passenger train that exemplifies the golden era of rail transportation, passenger rail transportation in America in one train set. So you can walk from coach to dining car to sleeper to the Pullman with a steam locomotive or an SD9 on either end of the train. So it's a pretty incredible experience that we've been able to develop and will continue to develop over here.
Jeez, well, I'm going to say I knew you 10 years ago when we were on the NS line from Youngstown to Ash to Beulah, which we covered.
We were only children then, Nick. we were but babies.
Well,
but
you can still be kids at heart.
But enough about me, sir.
Take it, run with it.
So, Nick, the Roundhouse, 10 years. The Roundhouse is designed to bring, as your website says, the most intriguing news stories and events about the railroad industry, the hobby, to the masses. And that's a really nice, tidy statement for what really is a major labor of love. There really is so much work that goes into the research, the development, the interviewing, the questions, the editing, the post-production, and really just kind of getting over the ego of being an artist, because when you put yourself out there, you really have to get your own self out of the way, and in order to create, which is a process that I've struggled with throughout my artistic career too. Can you take the audience back 10 years and put us in the moment that pushed you over the edge to when you decided, okay, I'm going to do this thing called the Roundhouse?
Certainly. Going back a little further than that, my first regular web content or series I started in 2008. It was a YouTube series called At the Rail Yard, and it was a show focused on reviewing train simulator products, but doing it with a music video / movie trailer flair and sensibility, so that it wasn't just a dry product review, it was a presentation. And as I was learning more about the real histories tied to these train simulator products and the routes they covered and the equipment, that led me to push myself more to cover that side of it in the context of the review. And as I came to learn more about these stories, I thought, well, there has to be another way that I can explore these more and put them at the front and center. So that was 2013, 2014 when I started having these ideas. And then the end of 2014, beginning of 2015 was not a good period in my life. I was living in Pittsburgh, which is a lovely city, but I was not having
unrelated to the bad part of your life.
Yes, no, Pittsburgh is a lovely city, and I did like living there, but I was a year and a half out of college, and I was not having any luck with finding career opportunities, getting into ad agencies, or really anything that was sticking, combined with then being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune disease, in January. So it was at a pretty low point, and I felt like I needed to embark on something that I could be in control of because there were all these things in my life that I couldn't do anything about. And the podcast idea had been floating around. I can't say exactly where it clicked. The only clicking memory that I have is I was walking into the supermarket with my then girlfriend, now wife, and brainstorming ideas. And I said to her, well, I'm considering this one show name idea, and I forget what that original idea was. It could be this thing, or it could be the Roundhouse. And as soon as I said the Roundhouse, it clicked. That was going to be the name for it. This idea of this gathering place of locomotives and crew digitized as a podcast. So then I went about trying to find people that I thought an audience would like to hear from, and really diversifying where I was covering these stories. So not just model railroading, not just freight railroad industry, not just tourist railroad industry, but a mixture of these and more.
What were you listening to or watching or consuming at the time that would have like influenced your creative career, or would have inspired the creation of the Roundhouse, or helped inspire?
As far as how to create a podcast, I was listening to The School of Podcasting by Dave Jackson. That helped me to get my feet on the ground technically. Story-wise, that's harder to say because I'm not a huge consumer of podcasts. And honestly, even these days, the podcasts that I listen to aren't indicative of the style that I've set for the show. But I think I just had enough idea of in my mind what an interview looked like. And to your opening about the artistry involved with it, that's something that I've come to learn through the years of interviewing people, is that it's very easy to think of interviewing people as just asking questions. But it is so much more than that. It's being aware that it's an open conversation, that there is an audience, and doing the research in advance to know as much as you can about your subject, and then being flexible so that when they're presenting little nuggets of their story, they may not elaborate on them, but you kind of make a mental note, or a written note in some cases, to come back to that and say, well, tell me more about this thing. And that was the number one goal throughout, is I knew that this was a podcast. This was not going to be a chat show podcast where it's just conversation in a sort of loose form. I wanted there to be structure. It is still a conversation, but it's a conversation which is very much about the guest. I am just here to facilitate that.
Yeah, it's way more intentional than perhaps a lot of people realize. But that is part of the seamlessness of being an audience member. And it's not the audience's job to think about how something is made. It's they're there to have a passive, entertaining, educational experience. So that's the hallmark of a good piece of media. So they don't have to sit there and think about how is this made, unless they are truly interested in the process or inspired by it. So.
Right. And I do think that our generation and younger are increasingly curious about behind the scenes elements of things. And so I try to be transparent about that in my philosophy of how I approach the conversations, because I know that they really want an understanding of how rail preservation works. They want an understanding of how the freight industry works. And both of those are very complex machines, if you will. And so the more that I can help to break that down and help lead my guest to breaking that down when it's on those subjects, if it's not a personal story, or it's personal story mixed with industry, which is a great combination. It depends on the guest, it depends on the subject, but I think that the goal is to make these things approachable. I always create these episodes so that when my mom is listening at home, who is a fan of trains but not a rail fan, that she can understand what's going on and that there's something she can take away from it.
Yeah, it's easy listening for whomever the audience might be. There's another podcast that does a really tremendous job at making this kind of content accessible, and it's the are you familiar with the Living with Steam podcast? Um,
I'm not.
yeah,
That's the first time
yeah.
hearing about it.
Aaron Heverin has taken the recordings of a railroad documentarian, John Prophet, who recorded a lot of railroad sound effects and audio on a wire recorder, and he's been digitizing the sound effects of New York Central steam locomotives and Pennsylvania Railroad and just a wide gamut of sound effects from the era in an era when people weren't necessarily recording just the audio. This is pre-Winston Link, of course, and on a wire recorder, which is a very unusual piece of technology. But Aaron breaks down the industry, the technology, everything, so that no matter who you are, and I think I've seen some people in our industry kind of look down their nose at some of the breakdown because they're so impatient at how detailed it might get or how accessible it might be. But it's like, no, we're trying to broaden this up to anybody that might be intrigued by it. And we want to make it digestible and understandable and reduce that barrier of entry there. So the fact that that has been a driving force in your conversations, I think, is really important. And something I think that gets lost, not just in our industry, but in a lot of content creation, is that these conversations that you have as a content creator, even though I have feelings about that phrase,
Same.
these conversations would not be accessible to 98% of your audience normally, and you have young adults, teenagers, kids, etc., who have no ability to access the aspects of the industry that you touch on. How many people that listen to this podcast will ever sit down with Wick Mormon, for instance, so to be able to open up these conversations, to provide access to these people, access to these topics, is really, really incredible. And I think doesn't really get the sort of recognition or understanding that it does. Because a lot of people, especially those of us that make stuff, it's understood. It's what we do. We make stuff accessible, and then we turn around and we make the next thing. And then people in our industry that consume it, well, we know who so and so is. We're familiar with such and such organization. It's sort of like if you go to RPCA or Heritage Rail, there's 100 people in a room and everybody knows each other. But what we rarely stop to think about is the 500 other people who will consume a piece of media who don't know who these people are, who don't have name recognition. It's just like when you post something on a forum or on Facebook, you may be responding to somebody in a chat or on RIPN, but the information that you're putting out is really for the general audience. And so the more accessible it is, the more detailed it is, the more forthcoming it is, the more anybody can access it, which is the whole point of having this media out there. And then I think you see it in your comments. Your comments are really the most indicative of your audience. And I think that's probably what I hope is one of the more rewarding parts, is that your comments that run the gamut from people that are in this industry, who are paid employees, who are in Class 1 regional tourism preservation, who are in gaming, who are into modeling, etc. And they all collect at the rail yard, at the roundhouse, as you say. So I hope that is rewarding to you, that even though certain types of media or certain types of conversations might not be for everybody, that they all sort of gather around the fireplace here for the Nick fireside chat at the roundhouse, which is pretty neat.
Well, thank you. I want our collective industries, freight industry and tourist railroad and heritage railroading, to focus more on people. I think that a lot of times historically, when our industries talk about people, it's either the folks who have been in it for 40 to 50 years or those who have high positions with well-established entities. And we need to hear from those too. I've talked to plenty of those people too. That is its own valuable perspective. But I wish that there was more conversation around, and I'm going to put heavy air quotes on this, but the average volunteer, the average track laborer, the average engineer. acknowledging that there is no such thing as average. In part, that's the point, is what is each individual's experience. And so I think that especially when it comes to making all of this work approachable, when it's the short lines looking to recruit train crews, when it's Heritage Railroading looking to recruit management and train crews and marketers, it's being able to say, here are the people behind that. Here are their characteristics, their qualities. Here's their relationship to trains. Here's what they are outside of railroading. And bringing that more into the conversation as well, because none of us are just our trains. I mean, we do eat them a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We do consume them a lot, but we are not entirely that. I enjoy practicing my accordion and walking dogs at my local humane society. And I think the more that we can push the needle in the direction of let's talk about people as people, which is something that also motivated me to form Next Generation Railroaders, which we could talk about later. That's been a key element of the motivation. And when you talk about the wide range of audience, I want people to feel like they're connected and or see the pathways to becoming connected. Growing up in northwestern Pennsylvania in the early 90s, I was in an area that didn't have a lot of rail preservation, and certainly nobody else my age in that area was a rail fan.
Mm-hmm.
So it was tough when I was making that transition from I am a rail fan because my dad was a rail fan and he instilled that in me, and I took that as a sign of fun, to how is this my own thing and how do I form my own relationships with this so it doesn't feel like I'm all alone doing that. And I was fortunate in that the internet was a thing and it was coming more into its own, and the kids these days have Discord. Back in the mid 2000s we had Skype, but these places where you could chat and hang out with other people your age, and that got me through. But being on the outside and seeing all this cool stuff when I'd see on the national picture and international picture what was going on and wanting to be part of that has always motivated why I want to do what I do and why I want to ensure that you guys who are joining us for this conversation, if you're not already tapped into these industries and you want in, hopefully I'm helping you to find ways in, either by highlighting the opportunities or just by being able to share other people's stories so that you can see what they did and how that might parallel the trajectory you want to take. The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you.
You earlier talked about focusing on people and telling stories. Why do you think our industry has such a problem talking about people or putting people forward?
I think there's a few reasons for that. Number one being the machines. Yes, we love the trades. I gave a presentation on this recently at Heritage Rail Alliance about, yes, we love the trades. Yes, we want to spotlight them. But if we are only highlighting narratives specific to the equipment internally within rail preservation as well as externally to the general public, are we missing out on those entry points of here are the people, here are the stories behind that equipment, here is why we as rail fans feel the way we do about that equipment? So I think that's a piece of it. I also think that because historically rail fandom and railroading was exclusively a male industry and therefore a male hobby, and thankfully both have diversified significantly. But a lot of times, I think with men in our culture, we bond over the things we do, where women are more encouraged to bond with each other directly. And so I think it's kind of a variety of factors along those lines. But the reality is, those connections do not have to be gendered. And I think the more that we are building interpersonal connections and illustrating the power of doing freight railroading or heritage railroading as a means of building those connections, the more we can progress that narrative.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think too that there might be an aspect to, I think a lot of people are very sensitive to being pedestalized or lionized, because this is also an industry with a lot of opinions, and the moment that you speak up or speak out, you can put a pretty significant target on your back, for genuine critique or just for ridiculous criticism. And I think maybe that's why too that there aren't more broader conversations, especially in this digital sphere. I mean, how many railroading podcasts are there compared to other industries? I mean, I follow so many World War II content creators who are in the reenacting scene, and that's such a huge community. But I still feel like the content creator, digital creation podcast scene for rail preservation, for all these different genres of the railroad industry is still fairly limited. Like I was just remembering a podcast called Moving America by two Norfolk Southern employees,
Yes.
John Belcher and Mike Necessary. Those two guys were incredible to listen to. Really, really great stories. And they vanished probably because they obviously had to put their careers first. But that's just sort of an example of how like a lot of this is so close to people's livelihoods that it is challenging, it is difficult to have opinions or to have a voice in a much broader industry conversation without sort of running along that line of tension. And like I've experienced a degree of this too, that people think that Kelly Lynch is somebody because I might be on a podcast or I might be on a news story. And it's like, man, there's 5 people that care who Kelly Lynch is. And one of them is my mom. Like nobody else cares. Nobody else cares who Kelly Lynch is. So it's just, I think it's an interesting dichotomy because what we're seeing is we have an industry that means so much to so many people. The emotions run very high. There's a degree of protectivism, of tribalism, and the moment that somebody talks about something that we care about, people feel like they have to insert themselves or defend, and people confuse an interview or content as elevating a person when they're just trying to elevate a conversation, especially now that people's access to creating media, to producing and publishing content is so easy. Anybody can insert their voice, but it's really the question then becomes like behind the artistry, behind having an audience and a following, and developing that to really kind of get your message and your story and your narrative out there, which is what you've been able to do with the Roundhouse and all the content that you've created and the audience that you've created as a result of it. But it just makes me wonder, like, why aren't there more Roundhouses? Not that there should be carbon copies of you, Nick. There's only one Nick, obviously. But it's just interesting to think about. But also, it's nice to sort of occupy a niche and make the most of it, right?
It is. So On the topic of difficult conversations, that's something that the more I become networked into both the heritage rail and freight industries, and I keep naming each of them because the more that I spend time in each, the more I realize they are their own worlds. There are crossover points, but they are very much their own worlds. And so I respect that. And that is difficult. You and I have both seen a lot. We see the good, we see the bad. We see the bad that gets discussed about, we see the bad that doesn't. And for me personally, that's something that I've struggled with because I want the best for the industries and I want the best for the people in those industries. And it's tough when you're presented with that, with knowledge that not everything is great. And the my it's a tough thing to explore because it is difficult to talk about these things in a way that's exploring the problem without being perceived as trying to diminish the industry or the accomplishments of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience with that was back in a few years ago with exploring the conversation of women in rail preservation. And I put this survey out for women to anonymously respond with experiences that they've had, including potentially negative experiences. And there were a lot of people that weren't crazy about the fact that I did that. There were a lot of people who were. I wish that conversation gone further. I designed that in part because I was hoping that it could continue, and clearly our industry was not ready for that yet. And I've come to respect that. That said, I met so many good people through it. I had so many good conversations off the record with people from it. I've made friends from it. It's informed the work that I do. So I'm not here to be a gotcha journalist. I'm not here to be a muckraker. I'm here to hear people's stories, and where they are comfortable, share them. And that's what I see my role as. And I'm still learning what that balance looks like because I want everybody to have their opportunity. And it hurts me when I see people who have been denied that opportunity or given grief because of their sex or their race or their ethnicity or whatever the case may be. And I hope that people, when they listen to the podcast, understand that I'm trying as best I can to provide this space, and hence also Next Generation Railroaders as a nonprofit where those are values that we take seriously. It's difficult to navigate these conversations, as you allude to the fact that with the Moving America podcast, those guys were doing a great job, but who knows why they had to discontinue, given that they were active Norfolk Southern employees. I'm sure they faced their fair share of challenges of what do we talk about and what don't we talk about. And then on the topic of being able to do this podcast and why aren't there more out there, I would love to see more because I'm never going to run out of content. I'm never going to run out of stories. I have people asking, can we revisit guests that came on the show 10 years ago? And I am all for that. But it is hard from a labor standpoint. So the podcast up until 2021 was solely a hobby. It was solely a labor love. And so I did it as frequently as I was able to. So initially, in the first year, I was able to crank out one a week or one every 2 weeks. There were then a few periods where there were months by. Now I'm in this routine of one a month. But part of that is because now it's part of my business. To be clear, it is not a money-making part of my business. And I think a lot of entities that would want to get into podcasting, you need the time and you need to accept that it's in this hobby, it's probably not going to make you money, because the podcasts that make money are those that can attract mainstream celebrities and ergo huge audiences. And as much as I try to create my show with an eye towards anybody could listen to it. It's still going to attract primarily people in the industries or the hobby. And I'm okay with that. I've made my peace with that, even when I've watched numbers plateau and gone, I'd like this to grow further. But I'm at peace with that because now, since I've started doing communications and video work and digital storytelling as my paid profession, even though the podcast isn't making money, it's part of the nature of my business. And so I could ergo carve out the time and not feel guilty or not have it cutting into free time in the way that it used to. But I think it is dedication, which feels like I'm patting myself on the back, but you really do have to, if you're getting into creating any series, but a podcast is one example, you have to prepare for the fact that if you're going to try to make it a series, you're going to be for the long haul. You want to have some degree of regularity. You have to put in the work to get, in the case of me, it's contacting people, it's scheduling the interview, recording the interview, editing the interview, which now I have to give shout outs to my friends, John and Casey, who've started helping me on editing these episodes so that at least I don't have to do as much of that these days. But on your own, then for many years, it was just me editing. And it is a lot. And it's just being willing to see that through. And I would love to see more people enter this, because I'd love to be able to have other people's podcasts that I could put on in the car and listen to their conversations with people in the industry and the hobby. And I think that it's also, if you're serious about this, I mean, if you just want to do it for fun, you do that. But if you're serious about really wanting to talk to some of the big names in these industries or whatever you're pursuing, then being willing to be self-critical about how you're doing what you're doing, where can you improve, asking others for their feedback and advice so that you're willing to grow through it. And I think that's part of what I find motivating, is that even though I've been doing this for a number of years, I still am learning new things. I'm still pushing myself to make sure I'm trying to make the most of each conversation. And that's my best perspective on it. I'd love to see more podcasts. So podcasting is as easy as it's ever been. Just get your mic and go. But if you're serious about it, I'd happy to answer your questions for one thing, but also just know that you're going to have that initial excitement of doing this thing, and then 5 months later, you're saying, I'm still doing this thing. And you have to constantly revisit how you're feeling about that.
Yes, and what you're describing is conditioning for your real paid job. Is like the more you work those creative muscles, the easier they are to work when you really need them. So once you get into that cadence, it becomes a lot easier. But if you don't sit down at that computer and in Audition or Premiere or whatever you're editing in with any regularity, like it's like starting from scratch every single time. And then it feels like a chore, and then it's not very fun. And then it feels like a job that you're not getting paid for.
Right. It definitely has to balance out with the larger picture of things. And thankfully, so that change in 2021, I held a number of random jobs from that period in Pittsburgh of being unemployed until in the late 20-teens, I was working for an aerospace manufacturer doing their communications. COVID happens, I get laid off, and I've got this time, but I've also had been doing some freelance video projects here and there. And there was this momentum building where one project would happen, and that led to another project, which led to another project. So by the end of 2020, I'm saying to myself, and I'm saying to Bethany, my wife, maybe I could do this. And she's like, go for it. Very supportive. And so now I'm very fortunate in that I get to do video work for the tourist railroad industry, the freight industry, and really anybody who's video. I do video for other nonprofits that are completely unrelated to railroading, and I get gratification from that too. And I've certainly taken the skills that I've learned from podcasting and that idea of constructing a story And that's further informed on top of the work that I was doing with At the Rail Yard all the way back in the late 2000s. All of that has contributed to my digital storytelling sensibilities. And these things can fit together really nicely when I'm learning things from the podcast that I'm able to apply in how I'm helping to represent a client of mine and their goals and desires on camera.
Any interesting audience stats or numbers that you'd be willing to share over the 10 years? Like, how has this following grown, and has any of those stats surprised you?
I don't know about surprise. There's definitely been disappointment because honestly, it is the show has been at roughly the same listenership for the past several years. And it's something that at times it really caused me to bite my nails and go, why isn't this thing growing more? And I would see other podcasts outperform me in terms of their numbers, usually within model railroading. There's a lot of model railroading podcasts, hence why I occasionally cover topics on that front, but I don't delve into it too heavily because there's plenty of others that do. And the thing that I came to peace with is because I've decided to cover this variety of subjects, and some of them are people that I approach, some of them are entities that approach me saying, hey, we'd love to have this person on your show. Some of them come about in all sorts of random ways. From my wife and I were doing a puzzle, and she said, you should interview the artist. It was a Lionel puzzle with that was from a painting. So I listened to Bethany and I interviewed the artist. And I would like to think that there's a consistent quality through what I deliver on the podcast. But everybody is different in terms of the guests. Everybody brings something different to the table. So you're getting a different story and you're getting a different storyteller each time. Or co-storyteller, depending on how you define it. So it's not the same as, say, the Son versus Son podcast, which I'm a huge fan of, where I know I'm going to get the same host every time, maybe a guest host, and and it covers the same beats. There's a lot of variety when we're talking about going from a musician to somebody who's doing train simulator work to the communications person for a short line railroad. I mean, those tonally go very different places. They vary greatly in terms of how personal the stories get. Some get very personal. Some are very, they're more corporate, I would say. Right. Not bad, but it's just a different perspective. And so there are people who are going to listen to every single episode. And for those of you, I thank you for coming along for the journey and learning from all these different perspectives. But there are those who are going to be looking for just the short line industry stuff, just the railroad museum stuff. And I totally understand that. So I think the numbers, I'm hesitant to say them because I don't think they're the be all and end all of it, because the amount of times that, especially through my work with Streamliner Media, I'm going to customers of mine and I'm getting to talk to the shop crews and the train crews, and people recognize the show. They're like, oh, I love the podcast. Mm-hmm. It's so, that is rewarding in its own right. And that's powerful in its own right. You know, I could say that I had a certain amount of listeners, but if I said that I had, and this is not the number, but what's the difference between 50,000 listeners who are just consuming versus 5,000 listeners who are not only consuming, but engaged in what's going on? And the listeners who are coming to the show regularly, there's an engagement that I feel with them based on what they're doing in their own lives, as well as when I talk to them about what the show means to them and what they're getting out of it. And so there's an impact that's not traceable. And that comes back to as well as far as what people might be looking for if they got into podcasting about either of the rail industries, is that the numbers you may not love the numbers you're getting, but if you're doing something that matters to people, that it has this whole other level of impact that you can't measure, but it's
Yeah,
there.
and what you're describing sounds like a consistent following, regardless of the topical changes and the hops from industry to industry, which is really good. So I think that's great.
One of the strangest, wonderfully strangest interactions I've had is I was doing work for Iowa Interstate out in Iowa, great class 2 railroad, and I was filming this revenue freight train that was going from point A to point B. So I was talking with the crew about what their plan for the day was, just to kind of get a little sense. I was attached the cameras to the locomotives. So I was talking with that, and then at the very end, the conductor, who's about my age, says, "Okay, I'll be seeing you at the rail yard." And folks, fans of At the Rail Yard will know that was my go-to phrase when I introduced episodes of the YouTube series, kind of the equivalent of Today on the Roundhouse. And so it's things like that where I've made content that people who grew up on it, who then got into the industry, they watched that and now they're here. That is such a reward in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think that I mean you touched on this a second ago, that there is such an overemphasis on likes, shares, comments, subscribes, views. But a part of what you're doing is pursuing a passion and putting out a narrative, a story, and other people's stories that otherwise wouldn't be out there, that are now sort of evergreen, that can be discovered over and over again by people that are not current subscribers, that are by and large, for the most part, also on YouTube, so they can be eventually searched thanks to the algorithm monsters. So it's not just for the here and now, and it's okay to make content that doesn't appeal to everybody all the time, and it's okay that some content just is not appreciated or valued. Not everything has to be loved by everybody all the time too, and that again is, I think, part of the death of the ego of the artist, is that you're making something because you love it and you want to put it out there. You're not necessarily making it for the audience reception, but you are hoping that it does move the needle at the end of the day. Like, you're hoping that as a byproduct of all this effort that you're putting into it.
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult to find opportunities on the heritage railroading side to get paid to do what you love, let alone make a living off of it. That is hard. And that's another thing with podcasting, is you may not even break even, let alone be making anything off of it, let alone career-wise. And so but for me, the motivator isn't, there's this feeling that I have that this should exist. And I'll be honest, there's been times before it became part of Streamliner Media where I considered maybe I need to throw in the towel. Maybe I'm not enjoying this as much as I used to, and more so just the process. I love the conversations, but the work is a lot, and I'm not an audiophile. I love video editing, but audio mixing and editing isn't so much my thing. And so that work is a lot. And so I was looking and going, maybe. And then as soon as I would think that the universe would manifest this opportunity upon me, something would come out of the woodwork because the podcast existed. And I go, darn it, that means I have to keep doing this.
Yep,
thing.
it's a monster you have to keep feeding.
But it's a monster, but it is a lovable, cuddly monster at the end of the day. It's this sense that I do believe that, and I don't always know why, and I think the whys vary from person to person, but there's always this sense to me that what I'm doing matters, and occasionally I hear these stories come out of the where people are vulnerable and admit, like, like this is stuff that I'm dealing with, and hearing your podcast is helpful because, and I really respect the power of that. I respect that what I'm doing means something, and I'm not always going to know what that is. I don't always. I love meeting listeners out in the field. I love meeting you guys in person when our paths cross. I just came back from the Amherst train show, and it was so wonderful that despite this being a podcast where people can't see my face, they heard me talking and they go, "Are you Nick Ozorak?" So that is gratifying, and I really try to live and operate the show by the creed of the roundhouse is our house.
I think that's your ethos. And going back to what we were kind of talking about earlier, I think a lot of people that have an audience or a following, they think that they think they should treat it as the bully pulpit. And what I see often, especially in rail preservation, is that everybody wants to be a sheriff, but few people want to be a shepherd. And I think that what you're describing are the qualities of a shepherd. You're shepherding a community, a conversation, even though the animals and the livestock might be very different. You're still kind of gathering up this herd of animals, to really stretch this metaphor even further. But you're putting them all together in the same place that they perhaps wouldn't normally be. And if some want to participate and listen to a particular topic, they can opt in, they can opt out. But I think that's really key to creating content for this audience as well, especially when it comes to addressing some of these problems that you've kind of just touched on a little bit, is that no one single podcast or Facebook comment or post on RYPN or train orders is going to solve every problem in rail preservation or anywhere else in any industry. But people seek the vindication and the satisfaction of putting their voice out there. But the actual resolution and getting the solution takes years and years and years and years and years. And you can only do that through conscientious, considerate, tenacious work. And part of that work is really the act of creating. So I think that really, like, creating a podcast, especially for 10 years, I mean, that's pretty neat when you think about it in those terms. Like, you are cultivating this narrative, you're bringing together all these different stories. And now you do have people that recognize you by your voice. But it's as much about your voice, but it's about everything that they've heard your voice say and the conversations that your voice has brought people into. I'm starting to feel like we're on like an NPR or one of those like actor master classes on YouTube.
I am all here for it. I am all here.
Tell me about your acting process, Nick.
Well, and we're gonna go deep because you said something that has been on my mind very heavily within the past month, which is a month ago I had a personal epiphany where I realized for myself as a person that I am the shepherd. That was the exact thing that I thought. And I was thinking about it in terms of the podcast, in terms of these relationships that I'm building through stories on and off the record with people. I thought that about myself, and I'm not trying to self-aggrandize, and I'm not trying to make myself like the center. It's about what I can do, and that's something that I've thought a lot about, especially because, to your point about these online forums, I'm really concerned about the health of the discourse in our industry. Our industry needs spaces of healthy discourse. And kudos to you and the Head of the Torch team for giving one of the few really solid platforms for that. The only unfortunate thing is you're stuck on Facebook, and I have issues with Facebook. And so, but you guys are worth it. You guys are worth it in that regard. And so, I'm thinking about all of these things, and that's something that's very actively on my mind at the moment, is What can I do / we do to be gathering, to be sharing in what we love, to be sharing in knowledge, because that's going to be really important going forward. We need to be shoring up our relationships as much as possible. I've seen online volunteers of the same nonprofit that know each other in person getting into really nasty discourse, and where in person everything's fine, because I reached out to one of them and I'm like, that guy's kind of being a jerk to you. Is he like that in person? And the guy's like, no, he's not like that in person. So I'm really acutely aware of the need to ensure that we have constructive, wholesome conversations. And that's why, shameless plug for Next Generation Railroaders, we are embarking on virtual programming from experts and mentors in the field that are going to be talking about skills. And you can learn more by going to nextgenrr.org. And we have our email alerts that you can sign up for. And we'll be announcing the dates for that. Probably by the time this podcast comes out, we'll actually have a date and a time announced. Because we need these gathering places where there is healthy conversation. I feel so strongly about, let us lead ourselves away from that which is not helping to build our futures, that's not helping to bring the New York Central back onto the main line with 3001 and 7 genuine New York Central coaches, and go towards that. And that's something I think all of us have a responsibility as fans and as people to be mindful of, is what are we contributing to the discourse, certainly of rail preservation, but I mean, even in general, I think it's healthy. But I think rail preservation is a great trial balloon for how we conduct ourselves. And I think the more that we take ego out of it as much as we can, it's inevitable, it's going to be there. I can't pretend that I am not something of a personality, and that I'm not something of being a person in a position of having certain knowledge and certain privilege. I wholly acknowledge that. But I'm doing the best that I can to try to share that as much as possible. And I think that we can all try to be mindful of that, is where we have that, how do we share that, and how do we build off of that?
Can you elaborate a little bit, Nick? Where did the real impetus for Next Generation Railroaders come from? Was that because there was an entity that was missing from the lineup of rail preservation orgs that catered specifically to developing this space for younger adults?
Exactly. So there are obviously a lot of great nonprofit organizations that we have in the US and abroad. There are, speaking for the US, you have great ones that at the end of the day, they have to focus on what's under their roof, because that is their mission, and that's completely understandable. And they may be able to institute great programming and great volunteer opportunities, such as Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. So that's one piece of it. But Fort Wayne has to focus on Fort Wayne to a point. It can help the larger community, and has, but any nonprofit that has a mission centered to a region or a specific equipment, at the end of the day, comes back to that. And then on the national front, you do have some great organizations like Heritage Rail Alliance, which focus, if you're not familiar with that, it's kind of like a chamber of commerce for tourist railroads. But there wasn't any organization where development of people was at the core. And that felt like an opportunity to say, okay, here's this great stuff that is going on that we see in Fort Wayne, that we see at Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington, that we see at Mount Rainier. Sorry if I'm not shouting you out here, guys. I mean, this list could go on for a while, but just to name drop a few that I think are getting it right. here's these great opportunities that are going, and here's what they're able to do. What if there's something that bridges that? And combine that with thinking about the podcast and this gathering of oral histories and how so often the knowledge that these experienced veterans have, if we're lucky, they'll at the least hand it down to somebody else and tell you, here's how you service a hydrostatic lubricator. But there isn't always the documentation to go along with that, whether that be recording that person's knowledge orally or having it written down. Next Generation Railroaders is our attempt to try to be able to collect these practices, from that refine what we see collectively as best practices, and capturing this knowledge, and while being able to translate it into tangible, executable action. I want people, especially youth, which we've loosely defined as 18 to 45, but obviously in the long run we want to be able to engage audiences even younger than that, because we want those people who feel like they're on the outside to see the opportunities to get in and have those open doors illustrated, either because they're already out there and just pointing them in the right direction, or understanding organizations that could have them open, that maybe just need a little bit of help with opening them up and then directing and being able to have this. I see a lot of potential with what it means to have this repository of knowledge and the network that can be built and the sub-networks that can be built by connecting people with each other and centering it on individual skills and individual experiences and how to build off of that. And in fact, our first guest speaker is going to be Ed Lockyer, who is the trainmaster at Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington. Although maybe he's a board member, maybe he changed roles from trainmaster, but he was trainmaster at one point. He's a board member there, and so he's going to talk about the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway, which is up in Maine, and we've covered on the show here before. But doing so from a standpoint of, here are the roles and responsibilities he has, here's how he got to his position, here is the operations of the railroad from his perspective, interacting with volunteers, what he sees as good attributes for volunteers. So there's something actionable about it. There's always going to be a space for the Zooms where we learn about histories of places. This is a place where hopefully everybody's coming away with a take-home lesson of either, if they're on the outside, how to get in, or if they are established, just a point of reflection to say, these seem like good practices. Are we at our organization doing that as well? So that's, in a nutshell, what we're looking to accomplish with Next Generation Railroaders over the coming years.
It sounds like you guys are working on being the shepherds, which is exactly what we were talking about. So that's pretty great.
I think there's a lot of people, I've met so many people with so much knowledge that are so, I mean, you know these people too, Kelly. They're people that, so many people we know that many of the listeners here might not have heard of them before, but boy, are they in the trenches. They are behind a lot of things that nobody knows they're behind, because they just put their nose to the grindstone and do it. And I want to celebrate those individuals, but as you say, not pedestaling them, but celebrating them, because so many of us within the heritage rail landscape are just about putting our nose to the grindstone and getting the work done.
You sometimes you can't talk about the work unless you talk about the people doing the work, which is the unfortunate conundrum, and I think I've shared with you before, one of my favorite quotes is, there's no limit to what a person can do if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. So like, if you can just get yourself out of the way and talk about the work, but sometimes you have to talk about the person, but that doesn't mean you can't talk about other people either. Like everybody thinks Ed Dickens single-handedly restored the big boy, but there's a whole team. There's a whole ecosystem and a structure at Union Pacific that facilitated that. He's the front man, and it's actually his job to be the front man. So when people criticize him as an example, it just doesn't see the forest from the trees.
No, and actually, I had the chance to see Ed speak in person this past summer in Roseville at one of their whistle stops with Big Boy. And he had a few of his guys with him under the tent presenting on the locomotive. So people would ask their questions, ranging from the foam heavy to the foam light about Big Boy or about the operation. And he made an effort to not hog the microphone. He was saying, well, I'll hand it off to so-and-so so that they could talk about this element. Even though he probably could have answered every single question they had, he made the effort to spotlight others. And I think that was really magnanimous of him. And I think that it illustrates the sustainability. So Union Pacific is always this kind of standout because it's a multi-million-dollar entity funding this locomotive, but there are lessons of what it means to have a team and to highlight that team that we could take away from them. And part of that is making sure that I think in most cases any organization should try not to be in a position of hinging their identity on a single person. I mean, yes, you may have your characters and certainly highlight them, but the more that you can say, here's everybody behind the team, then the more approachable it becomes, and the more that people can see, okay, this is the lay of the land. These are the opportunities that exist. So they don't have to feel like that becoming the spokesperson is the point. Yep. And I think sometimes that is an erroneous message we see because of historically how we've talked about people is communicating this idea that you need to be the person at the top.
This idea of hero worship is a very outdated sort of perspective, because pre-internet you did have the single person that was the representative, and now you can spread the microphone around a little bit.
And I think that the more that we could do that, the more we learn. That's, to me, that I love going to places and talking with, and again, one of the many privileges afforded by the nature of the work that I do for Streamliner Media is going to these tourist railroads and talking to the crews and learning their perspectives and learning from the machinists, learning from the train crews. And I pick up all these different things and I can bounce them in my head and compare them to other people's experiences in similar roles at other locations. And that was something that I work with this woman who provides, she's part of a nonprofit that provides advice and counseling for small businesses in my area in Central Virginia. And something that she encouraged me to think about is that because I'm in this perspective of getting to see all these different things at all these different railroads, what is the power of that knowledge and how, what does that mean? And to always be asking, what does that mean? And explore the curiosity behind that. And so I like using that as a means of comparing and learning from all these different corners of the country and internationally.
So you do have some audience questions, Nick. I think we should hop in and
let's go for it.
and visit with some of our friends here. So why don't we start with Chrissy in Green? Chris says, we've seen a lot of railroad and group representatives talk about the challenges they face with keeping railroad history alive for future generations, especially since COVID. What can you personally take away from their testimonies?
Power's in the people. At the end of every interview, just about, I ask my guest what they love most about their volunteering or their work. And pretty much every single time the answer is the people I work with, the people I volunteer with. So I think that so much of what I hear from a lot of tourist railroads and museums is we need people, we need staff, we need volunteers, and certainly money is there. But I think if you get the people, you get the money, and I mean that in the sense of if you're conveying the work that you do in a relatable, approachable manner, you're going to speak to people in ways that resonate with them, that will bring them into the fold, whether it be as volunteers. And then if you're really good at storytelling about your organization's mission and objectives and projects, you're going to get that grant money. You're going to get that donation.
Daniel asks, are there aspects of rail preservation and fandom that you feel are often overlooked or underrepresented?
I think one of the things I love doing on the podcast is, and off the podcast, is talking to people who are adjacent to railroading, which is to say that they do something that overlaps with railroading a bit, but they would not call themselves rail fans. Or maybe they haven't even thought about how what they do can overlap with railroading. But I'm seeing a connection, and so then I could craft a conversation on the podcast around this idea of talk about what you do, and then I could say, well, here's things from railroading, what do you see as the parallels? But that outside perspective is gold. I love talking to, when I meet people in real life who, when I'm just socializing with people that I've met through the podcast or that I've met through my work, especially fans, and they introduce me to their significant other. I love talking to the significant other about, okay, how did they introduce you to all this? And what is your takeaway from it? What do you like? Because you can learn so much from them, because they're seeing the depth that rail fandom can go, but they are not in it. So they are providing this outside perspective that is so valuable. So I am a big proponent of finding these people with tangential interests and learning what we can from them, for everything from modeling to how to market our experiences.
Joe asks, what's been your most memorable experience or story from the Roundhouse journey so far?
Well, there's two experiences in particular that I love talking about with people. As far as the events episodes where I've gone out and been part of an excursion or an experience and interviewed a bunch of people relating to that. Number one is Steampunk Unlimited, which the Strasburg Railroad used to host back in the mid-2010s. That was one of the most immersive experiences I've had as an attendee of an event, because steampunk is this rich fan culture of its own. And so bringing it in intersection with heritage railroading, with the Strasburg Railroad, where you're having, I remember riding on the dining car, and I'm in this nice wooden coach, and everybody else is dressed to the nines in their steampunk attire with the goggles and the big top hats. I loved that so much. And then the second one, I got to give you a shout out, Kelly, because it's Joliet Rocket. Being able to, Joliet Rocket, the idea of doing a mainline steam excursion, incentivizing people to dress as they were in the 40s and 50s, arriving in downtown Chicago by steam locomotive, that was its own sort of thrill, with my favorite part of that whole experience being in LaSalle Street and getting to do one of the departure announcements. I very much checked a bucket list item off when I was able to go, your attention, please. Train number one, the Joliet, and have my voice echoing through the skyscrapers of downtown Chicago for a steam excursion to party. Oh,
that's so cool. That reminds me, I was watching, there was a YouTube video on an O-Gauge 765 model, and they had Joliet Rocket station announcements in there. And I thought, how cool! Like a thing that we just invented is now in a model that people run around their house. Like, so that's a fun example of moving the needle. Unintended consequences. We could have never thought when we came up with that idea that someday somebody would program those sounds into an O gauge model, and that somebody would be running it around their layout of their basement someday.
I
So funny.
I am Yeah, I am fascinated by the concept of immersion, what we could do to take ourselves back and explore these histories by way of not just reenacting them, but enacting
Mhm.
them, creating new narratives of things that weren't, but might have been, could have been. That's something I could easily fill another podcast with alone. So, needless to say, if you like the idea of immersion in events and this kind of thing, hit me up. Or Kelly, because Kelly gets it
Yep.
too.
Look out for our collab in 2027.
I'm here for it.
Well, Nick, here we are. I think we've filled up our time slot. You've done a lot of work over the last 10 years developing the Roundhouse. Where do you hope to go from here?
Keep doing it. I feel like I learn so much by doing it, and I meet so many wonderful people, both those who I get the opportunity to interview as well as those I just have conversations with. I can't imagine. I could not imagine 10 years ago being here. So I can't imagine 10 years from now where I will be with it. I really want to continue to be doing it. And I couldn't even speculate as to what that'll look like. But I am excited by the journey of what it is. And I love the conversations and the opportunities to connect with people that it provides. So something along those lines is going to always be part of it. I mean, I'm one of these people. I can't I give credit to those who can, keep their nose to the grindstone, do their work. I always have to be a little bit in the spotlight. I'm kind of prone to it, but I don't know what form it's going to take. And I'm all here for the opportunities to bring other people who deserve their time in the spotlight. And I try to do that with every episode, is helping people to contextualize their story as best they can, as best as we can, to give that an audience that it deserves. Because everybody has a story, and everybody deserves to hear their story told, to have their story told to a wider audience and for others to learn from it.
All right, that's excellent. Any way you want to close this out beyond that? I mean, I think that's a really good way to.
Well, I'm gonna thank you for being the guest interviewer when this suggestion was made by listeners. I was like, there's only one person I know. I mean, I know a bunch of people, so I won't say, but
He's not the interviewer
there
we
was
need.
one person who I knew. There was one interviewer I knew who would understand the assignment, and Kelly, you absolutely understood it. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse. Look forward to whenever we get to bring you back so that we could once again turn that spotlight solely on you, hear about all of the exciting things that you are working on. Thank you so
Yep,
much.
I appreciate it, and congrats on your milestone here, Nick. And we'll talk soon.
And now, the question of the day.
Given that we are just embarking on 2025 as of recording this podcast, I asked you guys, what are you looking forward to in 2025? Here's a few of your responses from Facebook. Eric Capusta writes, the first runs of Reading 2100 as AFT 250. Having been involved with that engine since it arrived in Cleveland, it'll be worth it to see the dream come to fruition. Although I haven't been able to volunteer as much since I moved to Toledo, I still feel grateful to be part of the restoration effort. Bill Didden writes, Patriot Rail is restarting a tourist railroad operation in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Michael Lechicki writes, I am excited for the Phillipsburg Railroad historians to begin construction of their Becker Car House to house and restore the mothballed fleet of Centerville and Southwestern Railroad, one of America's oldest and most significant grand-scale railroads. And lastly, Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad writes, trains and more trains. Perfectly encapsulating. Your question of the day for this episode is, are there any other questions you have for me? Things that I didn't have time to cover in the podcast today. Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Before I sign off, I need to thank a few people. First of all, thanking Trevor Polzinski, the voice of every single Roundhouse intro that you've heard in days past. I haven't been properly crediting him, for which I apologize, and I'm going to start putting credits at the end of these episodes. So thank you, Trevor, for providing the perfect voiceover intro for these 10 years. I also want to thank my friend Casey, who's edited a few of the episodes you heard last year, and John, who has edited this episode and a few that came out recently as well. Lastly, I need to thank my mom, who has been a tremendous support through my life and continues to listen to episodes of the podcast and provide her perspective, and my wife, who has stood by my side and supported me since I first approached her and said, I'm thinking of doing a podcast. And finally, I want to thank you for listening. I know that I say at the end of every episode, the Roundhouse is our house, and I really try to live by that. I want you to feel like you're part of this conversation and part of this community of people who are deeply invested in trains and railroading. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.